How's everybody doing? This is Mr. Arvites with another Corona break history lesson. This is U.S. history. We're looking at the rise of Japan going into World War II. So we're actually going to start this one off from the beginning. You know, Japan is one of these countries that industrializes fairly late, looking at the 1890s, really 1880s, 1890s. Them and Russia kind of industrialized at the same time. And Japan begins to modernize all aspects of its culture. They get rid of a lot of the old type of classic Japanese dress. They're wearing more Western clothing. They build railroads all throughout Japan. They're going to have a modernized navy. And in, 1894, they're going to invade China in a Sino-Japanese war, which they're going to win. Now, the big thing, though, that made Japan kind of a global power that for people to actually consider is going to be when they actually went to war with Russia in 1904. They went to war with Russia over a little territory called Manchuria in China. And if you know anything about what's going on in China, China has had a rough century from the 1800 all the way through the 20th century. And it's about to kind of go through a big civil war period. And Japan and Russia are both going to kind of use that to try and get Manchuria, which is a mineral-rich area in northern China. And so they're going to fight this war. This is one of the first modern wars of the 20th century, really the first modern war of the 20th century, if we're being honest. And, Russia kind of brings its whole navy across the north and is going to attack Japan. And Japan just absolutely obliterates Russia's navy. We could argue this is one of the real causes of the Russian Revolution that's going to take place a decade later. But for Japan, it showed them that they could beat a European power. And for Asian powers at the time, that hadn't happened in a long time. And so Japan is now on that global stage. But even after that, people didn't take them too seriously. In World War I, they sided with the Allies. They attacked a couple of German ships, German ports here or there, and they never really got the recognition they needed. At the Versailles, treaty conference, right? Japan even offered to kind of broker treaty deals because they said, look, we didn't experience this war like you guys did. Maybe an outside influence would be good. But the Europeans, for a lot of different reasons, and we can argue all day what they are, but most assuredly racism is one of them, did not let the Japanese help negotiate that treaty at all. So they left that time and they were like, whatever, this is ridiculous. And so they were going to leave Versailles, not getting virtually anything for that war. Now, this is going to create a political kind of struggle in Japan going forward. Some people wanted to demilitarize, which was the common thing after World War I. A lot of countries demilitarized, and Japan kind of goes through that. But really, that kind of countered their culture in a lot of ways, and it created a lot of rifts. And so Japan is going to remilitarize starting in 1925. We call it the second militarization. And so Japan is going to start to remilitarize and rise up in power. And it really does kind of show you what's going to happen, because 1925 is when they remilitarize, and by early 1930s, that's when they're going to start to really try and conquer parts of East Asia. Now, the young emperor that we're going to talk about throughout World War II is Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito was born in 1901. He dies in 1989. So he does survive the entire war. He survives occupation, and he remains in play. And we'll talk about that at a totally different lesson as to why that is the case. Now, Hirohito is kind of like, viewed as, always the phrase, if you ever watch any World War II movie, they talk about their emperor being viewed as a living god. Now, a lot of people did buy into that because Japan had, again, monopolized education, much like Stalin, much like Mussolini, much like Hitler. You use education to facilitate that. So Japanese citizens had grown up, and that was what you were taught. You were taught loyalty to the emperor, right? And so that idea that you don't surrender and that you die for glory of the emperor and for your family is ingrained in them. And so when we talk about these Japanese soldiers fighting in World War II against Americans, when we go to Guadalcanal and we talk about how they just, ran across Banzai charges, just getting massacred because they firmly believe that was better than being taken prisoner. And it's also why they treat POWs as poorly as they do. And so, that's a big part of it. Now, the other thing we have to understand about Hirohito is he's not really a hands-on ruler. And I definitely would not say he was, because Hirohito tends to not be aware of a lot of things that are going on. And that's because Japanese culture, the emperor was not talking publicly. He didn't give public radio addresses all the time. He does give a couple right at the end of the war. But they're not doing that like they do in the U.S. or even in Russia, where Stalin gave a few public addresses. Instead, it was the prime minister who was the face. They had ministers in charge of everything. And what's crazy, like in Japan, the army was more or less like a political unit. And so the army actually could get elected to positions. In the United States, you can't be elected to president and still be a general. We have to make that distinction. And George Washington set that up with the precedent that he set after the American Revolution. Well, in Japan, they allowed their generals to be the head of government. And in World War II, the guy that we tend to look at is going to be Hideki Tojo. Tojo from 1884 to 1948. He dies in the trials after the war. Tojo is the kind of guy who really pushes for war against the United States. A lot of people talk about how he's one of the guys who really instituted that invasion of China. He was one of the guys who helped plan that out, and he's going to be one of the guys who's looked at as the responsible for a lot of the atrocities in the war. Now, whether or not he is responsible is kind of subject for debate, because I don't think Tojo exactly ordered the mass killing of civilians, though he didn't order their imprisonment either. So that's something to kind of remember. Now, as we talk about Japan going forward, we have to kind of look at a little time tree here, right? So Japan is going to start a war with China in September of 1931. So World War II, we often think of in the United States, we're like, oh, December 7th, 1941. Or in Europe, you're like, oh, September 1, 1939. Well, in China, 1931, September 19. Okay, and that's going to be because the Japanese are going to have a couple of their railways. Now, they had already occupied Manchuria thanks to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. So a couple of their railways are going to explode, and they're going to blame it on the Japanese, or the Chinese rather. And there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment already in Japan, and they are actually going to invade Manchuria and take over the rest of it in a matter of months. And they're going to, very modernized army, right? Fast moving. They use planes to bomb for the first time. So it's kind of really the first modernized World War II style war that we see, though they're going to change a lot of those strategies going forward. But they invade Manchuria. Most countries kind of didn't really care. And being very honest, the United States didn't really care about the invasion of Manchuria. It didn't really affect us. It wasn't something that was, a big deal. However, in Japan, it was, because really the emperor didn't really know this was going on. The army had just kind of done it. And so that creates a little bit of a power struggle going forward. The military is ultimately going to win that power struggle. Okay, they're ultimately going to win that power struggle. Now, the war itself, despite a 2-to-1 disadvantage in terms of numericals, the Japanese are going to prevail, and they're going to make Manchuria Manchukuo, and they're going to create a puppet state there, and that's going to just fill the Japanese with natural resources. Now, what are these natural resources for? They're for the building of an even more modern army with more tanks, more artillery, more ships for an eventual invasion of China. Japan looks at itself in a lot of ways like the British. They're an island nation. They knew they needed to have a strong navy. They believed, the British controlled at this point in time, you got to remember, right? India, large portions of Africa, you still have Australia under their wing. You talk about Canada and, of course, the British Isles. They're controlling large portions of the earth from just an island. And Japan said, hey, why not us? And so they're looking at an invasion of China. They're looking at the reconquest of all the European and American colonies in the East Asian Pacific area. So that's what Japan's kind of building for with all these natural resources. And they're going to get that accomplished. And one of the things that I think is kind of crazy is the eventual invasion of China, right, which is going to happen in the late 1930s. They're going to go to war and declare war on China after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where the Marco Polo Bridge is attacked, and there's a whole bunch of different stories. Basically, the Japanese made up a reason to invade China, and they do. And this is going to create an extremely violent war. The Japanese war in China is probably one of the, if not the most violent wars in all of human history. In fact, we don't quite know exactly how many Chinese people died. We do know that it's right, early estimates were right around like 10 million, but now that number, I've seen it as high as 21 million, almost eclipsing what the Russians faced against the Germans. And so we see some horrible events. And so if you thought that genocide would only be talked about when you talk about the Germans, no, because the Japanese do horrible things to the Chinese. We're talking medical experiments, prison camps where they just shoot people. But the most famous, the one that you should always learn about in class, that for whatever reason we don't always cover because of time and because textbooks leave it out, is going to be the rape of Nanking, or Namjing, depending on the translation. That's going to take place, the ancient city of Nanking, December of 1937. This is the historic capital of that region of China. It's a very culturally significant city, and they held out a little bit against the Japanese military. And what the Japanese military does in Nanking is they're going to systematically execute 300,000 people over the next couple of months. And most of them are going to be women and children. A lot of the men evacuated, but the men will be executed as well. Almost all the men are beheaded. But if you look at one of the pictures that I have kind of showing you, they're going to use men as bayonet practice too. So when this whole thing settles down, they have all these POWs. It's called the Rape of Nanking because there's an estimate estimated 120,000 women that are raped during this time period. And there's actually a couple of really good books. The best one is literally titled The Rape of Nanking, and I highly recommend you read it if you want to know about this atrocity. But the Japanese really do a number on this on this city, and they're going to use people as target practice. They talk about them, strapping people to a car and then using artillery to hit the car. They talk about people using small children and babies as downrange firing targets, and of course the obvious stabbing of the people with bayonets, the practicing of that. And so the pictures that you see, these are not easy pictures to look at. You have decapitated heads. There's a burial site where they buried heads away from the bodies, and the reason they did that was because it violated some Chinese cultures at the time, and so that was part of their rationale in that as well. Now, the rape of Nanking and other events like it, because there are other events, that's just simply one of the largest. There are the amount of small towns that are just simply massacred during this war is just unfathomable. And the Chinese, and people don't always talk about the Chinese in World War II, and they should. It's an underrepresented group in our history courses, because the Chinese are going to fight from 1937, really you could argue 1931, and they're going to be fighting all the way to 1945, and they're going to be, really bogging down a huge number of Japanese soldiers that would have really given the U.S. trouble if they could have been put in the Asian Pacific. But as we know, that kind of didn't happen. Now, so what happens in China as a result? Well, China had a lot of issues as well. They're going through a civil war period. You have the communists led by Mao Zedong, and then you also had, they have their little royalists, they have their kind of republicanists, and so they all kind of band together. And Mao Zedong is going to be the guy by the end of this who's kind of looked at as one of the military leaders of this, and looked at as a hero for a lot of the Chinese people. And then, of course, he's going to form the communist China that we know today, though not quite the one we know today, because he's going to have a whole bunch of people killed for lots of different reasons, much like our guy Joseph Stalin. So what does the United States do in this? And that's the real question. Well, the U.S. is like, FDR says we need to quarantine the lawlessness. We can't have all this. But immediately Congress is going to pass a Neutrality Act and say, hey, we're not doing anything. We did criticize China for violating a couple of treaties. But the reality is, what are you going to do if you're FDR, right? Could you really go to war in 1937? In the middle of the Great Depression, right? And look, the Great Depression is winding down, but once Social Security got put in, which it did get put in 1937-38, our economy tanked again. And so we didn't have the fundamental resources to go to war with Japan, but we criticize them a little bit openly. We're still going to sell them stuff. And that's the thing that people don't always realize. We're selling them steel. We're selling them oil. We actually exchanged aircraft carriers in the early 30s as part of a program. So it's kind of funny. And I always say this in my classes. Those planes and those aircraft carriers that end up bombing Pearl Harbor, if you're wondering how they manufacture them, you just got to look to U.S. Steel. And really, when we think about why is Japan going to go to war with the United States eventually, it's going to be because as the war progresses, as these incursions in China increase, and as they start to attack other Allied territories, as Hitler invades Europe, they begin to attack Allied controlled territories in the Pacific. We begin to say, hey, wait a second, we're not going to sell you oil anymore. We're not going to sell you steel anymore. And then we're going to freeze all Japanese assets. And it's after those events that Pearl Harbor is going to happen. But make no mistake, by the way, the Japanese have been planning a war with the United States for years, just like the United States have been planning a war with Japan since as early as Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt, after he met the Japanese ministers during the peace treaty of the Russo-Japanese War, said, I need plans on how we would beat them in a war. And that's what the Defense Department did. They put together plans, and the Japanese were doing the same. We're doing joint naval exercises in the 1930s, and guaranteed every movie you've ever seen kind of shows you that. If you've watched Pearl Harbor, god-awful movie, just one of the worst movies ever made. I could actually do an entire lesson on why that movie is horrible. Or if you watched Midway, which is slightly better, just came out a couple months back. Midway kind of shows you the relationship between the Japanese and the U.S. Navies kind of going forward. Now, the next lesson that we're going to look at is how do we get to Pearl Harbor, right? And how do the Japanese get to that point, and then what Pearl Harbor actually is. Because if you think Pearl Harbor is just December 7th, 1941, you're wrong. It's an actual invasion across all of our islands, all of our territories in the Pacific, and it's an immensely well planned out operation. They go into radio silence throughout the entire thing, and it catches us completely off guard. It's probably the largest failure in U.S. intelligence at that time period, easily at that time period. So that's going to be what we're doing going forward. So we're actually going to get, this is all the buildup is there, and now we're going to start to get into the actual war. So next time we're going to be talking about Pearl Harbor. We're going to be talking about Hitler's invasion of Europe, and we're going to get it going from there. Until next time, Mr. Arvites, later.